part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for stopping by to the latest edition of the Sable Brothers on the Baseline podcast, all part of the Press Play Podcast Network. We're your hosts, John Sable.
And I'm Scott Sable. And John, we're in a special place.
A special place that we absolutely love. We are in the Baseball Heritage Museum in Cleveland's East Side. On the site of League Park.
Hence the echo in here a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. Maybe not the greatest quality with the echo, but this building is well over 100 years old. This is the original Cleveland Indians ticket office and front office booth, I guess you could say, of the Indians when they played here in League Park. For fans that may not know League Park, the ballpark was, they moved out last year, I think it was 1946.
46, 47.
Something like that. They played part-time here after Municipal Stadium was built. Right. Of course, this stadium and this site hosted the 1920 World Series, which is, Scott, a great segue to our very interesting and special guest.
Which is it's funny because our conversation with this gentleman here, we've already been chatting 20 minutes, and now we actually have to get to the official conversation on the podcast. John, why don't you do the introduction?
He is an Ohio native with Cleveland and Columbus ties, a producer, director. You've probably watched some of his films. If you're a Cleveland sports fan, you probably watched Believeland. That was a ESPN documentary a few years ago. He also, in the last year, produced and directed War on the Diamond documentary regarding the on-field unfortunate death of former Indians player Ray Chapman and the rivalry between the Indians and the New York Yankees. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest is Andy Billman.
I love being here with you guys. The Sable energy is intense, just as intense as this echo. But drink some wine if you're listening to this, and everything will be just fine. But honored to be here. And this is, for people who have never been here, the Baseball Heritage Museum is a real special place. And there's lots of things to look at. Take the time, come down to League Park and check it out. It's a very, very cool piece of history.
So, Andy, tell us a little bit about yourself. Those of the people listening to this and Clevelanders who don't know who you are, where you came from, and how you got involved with your projects.
Well, I'll take it back to Ohio ties. So I went to the University of Toledo, and I got started by, like everybody else, did a radio internship at WFAN in Columbus, did another internship for a local gentleman to do high school football games, and then I met a gentleman at my uncle's wedding who worked at ESPN. And I told him, I said, when I graduate, if you can just help me get an interview, that would be wonderful. Right. And so I got an interview in 2002. I took my little Honda all the way across the country to Bristol, Connecticut in a snowstorm, and then got the job. Went out there in May 2002, started in July of 2002. Stayed at a Motel 6 for 2 weeks, like literally surviving and advancing. Worked on a little show called Sports Center for a while when it was really Sports Center.
When it was a big deal back then.
When it was a really big deal with Trey Wingo and like Chris Berman and Kenny Mayne and Steve Levy and all those guys. So I was very lucky, got a great job that kind of ingrained me in sports. I, from a very young age, love sports television, love sports. I obviously am a Cleveland fan, being born here, but I also love all sports. I love college football, I love college basketball. So it was a dream to work there. And luckily in 2009, my career was kind of changing. Not to give a history lesson, that's when the market was really changing. There was a big change in not just stocks and bonds, but television. It was, you could feel it was really changing. And documentaries in 07, 08 were doing horrible. And then ESPN came up with this idea with John Dahl, who I worked with for a long time, Connor Shell, who I worked with on several films. There was a Pete Rose film I worked with him on, a movie called 3. And this guy called Bill Simmons, and they were going to come up with 30 for 30. And they go, we would like to extend an invitation for you to come on and work with us. And I almost said no, because I told John and the guys, I'm like, but documentaries are doing terrible. Like, is this like the proper move? I have a family now. Sounds risky, but I ended up making the decision to do it. I learned a lot about filmmaking. So for those of you out there who want to know, I actually learned from the ground floor. Even though I worked at ESPN, I had done sports television, I had done sports shows, highlights, or the ESPY Awards. I worked on the ESPY Awards for a long time. So I did not have a background in documentary. So I learned by the ground up. I said I want to be thrown into what a normal producer should be doing. And I learned for years, and then luckily John and Connor believed in me to direct a film in 14. Then I directed Believeland 16 that really did change my life forever. Now I own my own production company along with 2 other gentlemen. We produce films all the time, actually ironically still for ESPN and for others like War on the Diamonds, independent film. So I'm very lucky, but my word out there for people who want to do it, you can do it. Like, you don't have to be from New York. You don't have to be from Chicago or LA. You can be from anywhere in the country, especially in today's climate where you can get avids and get systems how to learn. Just have confidence, but always have the ability to work hard and learn. That'd be my big tool.
The one thing I loved about Believeland was that you guys had to go back and and re-edit it because the Cavs won the title in 16.
Thank God.
Which is funny because you watch it the first time and then they won it like a month later?
Yeah, it was May of 14. I remember we were down, and I say we, I didn't play for the Cavs, but we were down 3-1. I was getting interviewed like crazy by people. And I said, I go, Game 5, so I made this prediction in the Toledo Blade. I go, here's my prediction. If I were the Warriors, I would not let the Cavs win Game 5. They're not losing Game 6 at home.
Right.
And that means it's Game 7.
Right.
I go, the Cavs will not lose at home. Once they won Game 5, I started getting texts like crazy. Said, "You saw your article?" Next thing I knew, I was on a plane going back. I saw Brian Windhurst, the ESPN reporter. We crossed paths because he was going to Oakland. I was obviously going into Cleveland, and we just sat there and giggled. And it was an amazing experience. There were so many emotions. Like, I don't want to underplay it. It changed my life. Like, I'm very, very lucky the Cavs won because it changed my life forever. And I remember sitting at the Eagle Saloon with Scott Rapp, and we were just sitting there talking. He goes, "What if they lose?" I'm like, They can't lose, Scott." I go, I really can't do this. Thank God they won.
And when you talk about the Cavs, imagine, and not to downplay an NBA championship, but imagine the Guardians, Indians in a World Series, or the Browns winning the Super Bowl. I mean, in my opinion, it would be magnitudes. And again, not to downplay, but that's just a little teaser, a little taste of what it would be if it were one of the other longer-standing franchises.
And I think the Browns, we all agree, the Browns will be something so big. We can't, because it's a Browns town and it's Canton. Let's put that aside. Let's go to the Guardians. Tito Francona will be hoisted like Caesar, going throughout the city in a scooter. Everyone will have a scooter.
Yeah, they'll hoist him while he's on his scooter.
Seriously.
Yeah.
No, I think we all dream about the Browns, and I understand. The Guardians will have a much large and very big reaction too. And I think any of those teams that were win, and honestly, if the Cavs were to win again, it would be a huge celebration. Look, I did Believeland for a lot of reasons, but big one that I still believe in. This town bleeds sports. It's not easy to admit. It's not maybe like, look, but we live and die by sports. Today's a mixed day. The Browns lost, the Cavs won, so we're okay today. It's not bad.
Right.
But believe me, last week when the Cavs couldn't win a game, couldn't sniff the win, and the Browns were being the Browns. I mean, I was in Jamaica on vacation, and I remember sitting there in Jamaica. My fiance's like, "What is your problem?" Like, our teams aren't winning. This rum runner's not working.
So, you know how you solve that?
What?
You have another rum runner.
Well, I did several rum runners, and I'll tell you, Jamaica helps. When you wake up to 80-degree weather,
Well, that's always
it always helps.
And then you show up here at League Park and there's 3 inches of snow.
Wow, but it's beautiful. It's nice.
That's a good segue here at League Park.
Yeah, so what was your impetus for doing this documentary, War on the Diamond? It's a little bit of a change in direction from doing Believeland, from doing the Cavs. What was your impetus for this? And take us back to the beginning.
Well, I grew up going to my dad was a baseball player, so we went to a lot of baseball games growing up. And my mom really loved the game. So because of that, we went to a lot of games. And to be honest, in the 80s and the early 90s, it was affordable. Going to Municipal was not an expensive ticket. In fact, for people who are too young to know, you used to bring in coolers.
Oh yeah.
We used to bring in big coolers to the game. And by the way, in the good old days, like in the early 90s, my dad would be like, "All right, as I have two brothers, Patrick, you sit here, Benji, you sit here, and there'd be rows. And then my dad would bring in a portable television. I know it sounds crazy, but that's what he did back in the day. With a battery pack, and we would watch college football as the Orioles were playing the drive in the game. And it brought back so many memories. But to why I did this film, when we were growing up, in the Major League years, which is not just a film, it's a documentary in Major League. That's what was really going on in the 80s. Sadly, we're out of those days. But you go there in the middle of the game and be like, what do these things mean? 48, okay, cool. Who's Lou Boudreau? Okay, cool. Who's this guy? Okay, cool. Like 54, oh, that sounds really nice. Rocky Colavito, okay, cool. What's 1920? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of people who know, and I didn't really know. In fact, when I did Believeland, Scott Rabb was the guy who goes, I'm putting a quarter day on Chapman's grave. I go, what is that? What does that comment mean? I go, who's Chapman? He goes, Ray Chapman? I'm like, yeah, tell me. Like, what does that mean? He goes, well, I put a quarter on Chapman's grave for good luck. A lot of people do that. I'm like, wow.
Why a quarter?
I don't know. If you go by the grave today, you'll still find some coins. That tradition has started to go away a little bit, but you will find coins.
I've seen that going in there.
Oh, yeah. You'll definitely find quarters and coins on there for people just to pay homage. So I did this film because I think it's a story that needs to be told. There's a gentleman named Tress Speaker, who is for people out there know, I will debate this, any kind of platform. The biggest trade in Indians Guardians history is Tress Speaker. It is not Andrew Miller. It is not the Sandy Alomar deal where we got from Joe Carter, we got all these different things. Right. It was Tress Speaker. In 16, he changed the organization. By the way, the Red Sox, same thing as Babe Ruth, cash. It was an all-cash transaction to get Speaker in the Cleveland business. The Red Sox owner was going broke.
$50,000, right?
It was like something like that. It was very similar. And Speaker didn't want to come. The Speaker had said Cleveland wasn't known as a winning organization. We just were winning championships here in Fenway. Like, why would I leave to go do that? So there's a lot of history in this story. And in particular here, I didn't know a lot about League Park. League Park is a jewel. It is a really cool place, and what's nice is it's a nice afternoon. It isn't like one of those places like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is great, but you have to go back several times because there's too many levels. And that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. League Park you can do in a nice afternoon, have a good sandwich, and walk around, and there's so much history here. And to think that Ruth and Ty Cobb and Chapman and Speaker and Cy Young were pitching on that mound, it just brings back a lot of history, at least to me.
Yeah, Bob Feller, too.
Bob Feller, too.
Yeah.
That's right. And Bobby Bill Veck at some point, even though he made the team too municipal.
What I think is fascinating, growing up in Cleveland, my brother and my dad, big baseball guys, just like, I got that from them.
Right.
Our grandfather, my dad's dad, was actually an usher at Old Municipal Stadium.
That's really cool.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, he would come to League Park as a kid, right, in the early 80s to watch games.
He lived down on Stowell Avenue.
That's cool.
Yeah, I'm pointing this way, but he would top the train and he'd come down here and go to games.
So while we're big, Indians fans growing up, we have like a special tie to some of the stadiums and arenas like this. So going here the first time in 2012 before they actually built this museum, to see the transformation is beautiful. Definitely encourage anyone to come here.
Again, it's a touch of history, and to be fair to this museum, it's not just Indians. No. You see a lot of things. You see, I see Clemente right here. You see a lot of other artifacts here. There's a lot of actually Negro League appreciation here too. Mm-hmm. It is a cool walkabout, and it's not big, so you can really take in a lot of stuff in a short walk. It's if you love history, you don't even have to love baseball. If you love history, this is history. Mm-hmm. Real jerseys, real things that bring it back to a different time period.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this story, Andy, because I remember hearing the story from my dad and my brother. Okay. And then you read up a lot about it, and then we just had the 100-year anniversary of it 2 years ago.
Yep.
And then your documentary came out. Explain the story so people can go and watch your documentary on this and how it kind of transformed the Indians organization then to now with the New York Yankees.
So, in my opinion, and the Sables should weigh in, I was taught very early on to hate the Yankees.
Sure.
That was really a given.
By the way, he has a shirt that says Jesus hates the Yankees.
It's true. I still have that shirt.
I can confirm it. But my whole point point is, you're going to hear this flack. Well, everybody hates the Yankees. Okay, sure. No, there's unique teams like Duke basketball, Notre Dame football, Yankees baseball. They're definitely in that paradigm of
Ohio State, Michigan,
right, where everybody kind of has a rivalry with them. But here's why it's a real rivalry. In 20, when they got Ruth, that's the first year Ruth was on the Yankees, neither organization had won a championship. The Indians, even through tragedy, won the World Series. It's very remarkable. 2, many moments in their 30s right after that with Feller. Feller made it a point anytime he could. I hate New York. I don't like these fans. I particularly don't like these people. And I really like showing it up to them. That played on through the press. That played on through fans. Fans would be holding up baby dolls to make fun of Feller and other Indians to say, you're crybabies, you're crybabies. Scott Longard, who's a wonderful read, has done a lot of good books on the Indians, and he really believes and professes this. So then let's go into more recent years. Okay, fine. Tom Verducci, who's that? This is a guy who does Fox on the field, big-time reporter, long-time journalist for the Yankees. When I reached out to him, he goes, not only do I believe in what you're doing, it is very truth. It goes, it is a real rivalry that people don't understand. And here's when it's a rivalry. You have a family member who owns the Yankees, and both teams have won. I know Yankees fans always say, well, you haven't won recently. Okay, sure, a little bit, but 48, 54, 1920, 97, 2007, there's been a lot of big moments the Indians have actually not only performed, but performed well. Here's another perspective. Bill Madden, who's in the film, longtime Yankees journalist, wrote a wonderful book called 54. And in 54, he explained the big year of Larry Doby and what was going on with the Yankees at that time. For people who don't know, Bill Madden, who did a lot of research on this, said there's only one team in the late 40s and early 50s who competed with the Yankees, and it's the Indians. There was no one else on that level. Think about that. The Indians stopped their reign championships as they won in 47. The Indians won in 48. And then they stopped them again in 54. In between, the Yankees won 5 straight World Series. 90s. 96, the Yankees won. What happened to the Indians? They won in 97. And then again, the Yankees went on a run. So the Indians, in multiple occasions where they've had this vaunted, and they were vaunted dynasties, the Indians were the only team twice in 2 different periods to stop the Yankees and win big. So that's where it's different. Royals, Yankees in the late 70s? Absolutely. That was some very, very fun battles. I'll even make it more local here. Cavs, Warriors, those were fantastic finals. No one will ever take that away. But that was a moment in time. I still hate the Warriors, of course. But over time, like you grow out and you start doing other things as a Cavs fan. Yankees, Guardians is forever. Forever. And it should be. It's a big thing.
Now, I have one bone to pick with you here because I remember watching the documentary I was talking about.
Here it goes.
Because I'm a child.
I'm ready.
I'm a child of the 80s. Now, I know everybody lumps, and this is just little thing. Everybody lumps the 70s and the 80s as 2 decades, as both decades are just really bad.
Yep.
You can kind of see, though, in the 80s, the 80s, they started getting a little better.
Yes, it did.
They started the Joe Carter years.
Yep.
You could see little glimmers of, wait a minute, there's something here. We didn't know it at the time, but in retrospect, Hank Peters was the GM, and you could kind of see the pieces were falling into place. And it wasn't until the mid-90s before,
I would just say this, like 86, the Indians had a winning record. Then they had the Indian Rising SI article, and then it went terribly.
To your point, you're right.
There's been a lot of times where the Indians looked like they had footing. To be truthful, in '93, the last year of the stadium, I mean, I've had a lot of stories on this, and it's a short documentary to be done. That's a horrible boat tragedy. Really changed '93 forever.
Really
that was supposed to be the launch year. If you really talk to Grover, you talk to guys on that team, Hamilton, like they'll say to you, like '93 was supposed to be the launch year, and for obvious reasons, the season went sideways. In fact, I would argue we were going to do this in the film. We ended up not doing it. I thought the Jim Abbott no-hitter was the breaking moment, where it finally broke in '93, where it's like, you know what? The bad Indians are done. This is it. This stuff stops. I remember watching that as a kid, and I was like, geez, we lost Jim Abbott in a no-hitter? And it's like, what else? And that was the last time I saw that. Actually, that was it. I really don't remember any more major league moments after that.
That's a great point. I remember watching that too, and that's a really good point because you remember Dave Steve threw a no-hitter against the Indians, and that would have been in '90. And then Tom Candiotti, I remember this to this day, and John I don't eat shelled sunflower seeds, and I have yet to have one since then because I was eating shelled sunflower seeds. Candiotti had a no-hitter into the 7th inning,
Good for you.
and I was 15. And what did I do? Mom put it on my salad. I ate it, and he blew the no-hitter. But anyway, that's the side.
Well, but you can't eat sunflower seeds.
Yeah,
I mean, it's what I'm saying.
No, if they have seeds on them, I'm fine. But you're right, though. You started seeing those changes, though, around that time.
It broke, in my opinion. If there's and by the way, like any documentary story, there's several stories that did not make the cut. There's a very sad story about a player for the Indians who had a mental breakdown after a Yankees game. Tony Horton, who never played another game in baseball. In fact, that was a story that I actually tried to find Tony. He did not want to come on camera, was not comfortable doing so. That's a story to be told too. And then there was an incident too with Ray Fosse, who had a cherry bomb thrown on his feet during a Yankees game in New York. So there's a lot of violent moments. There's a crazy Joe Pepitone fight where actually he took on the whole Indians, and the next thing you knew, Yankee fans came on and started fighting with Indians players.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of moments that could have been put in there. Obviously, you could have had 17 in there too. We hate to talk about 17. That was a terrible loss. I thought the Indians were going to win it all.
They were the Indians in 17 were stronger than in 16 for sure.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. They should have won it all. They didn't.
What changed in that series was Aaron Judge robbing Lindor's home run right field.
That did. I you know what? Well said. I point out to people all the time. I go, Carrasco was wonderful in Game 3.
Yeah.
Should have locked it up there. I went to Game 4. That was awful. I think that was the beginning of the end of Bauer, which is for another podcast.
Right.
But that was a tough defeat.
When you go through and edit, and I'm getting deep in the weeds here on
Go for
production. When you go through, it's kind of like when my brother shoots a story, and I've done this a little bit. My brother's more experienced than me. You shoot a story, you go out, you have, I'm making this up, a huge amount of video and sound bites.
Sure.
And then you have to whittle that down to something that's manageable for people to watch. Do you save some of those stories that you shoot and just save it because you never know if you're going to use it?
The worst situation in the world, John can weigh on this, is when you feel like you're short. So you always want to be heavy. Because the trick I learned at ESPN is you want the audience leaving for more. When you feels like you're stretched, the audience is going to feel like you're stretched. So that's a given too. There's always going to be stories that are on the floor that you're like, man, I wish we could put it in there. It just doesn't happen. You just have to be very judicious. Again, did I want there to be a story about what happened with Fosse? I did. Did I think the Tony Horton story is a wonderful story? I really did, but it just didn't
flow. It didn't mesh well with what you had.
It didn't flow, right. I did a wonderful interview with Jim Abbott. I really want to talk about his 93 because what he did changed his life because of the guy who actually has one hand. For him to throw a no-hitter, and he's a very good dude, that's a huge moment. And I told him, I go, honestly, and he said, I've heard that from people, that was the end of the Major League Indians. I'm like, you really put the final nail in the coffins. I go, that was the last time I really remember them kind of flailing. And by the way, it was because of Abbott's talent. But there's a lot of those stories. It happens often. You got to, in the chair, say, what is the best story? And believe me, there's a lot of stories in Believeland I wanted to tell.
Sure.
You just can't get it all in. You have to be very, very smart.
Do you ever think you'll resurrect any of these and put something together?
Yes. Oh, I did with this one. I mean, when I learned about Steinbrenner and Chapman, I was like, geez Louise, this makes... So I told someone, I go, well, now it makes sense because us as Clevelanders, we don't pick up random teams to hate. There's a story. There is an angst behind it. And once I heard what happened with Chapman and Mays, I go, well, this now makes sense. Like, this all adds up to why this rivalry really started.
So when I watched your documentary and kind of knowing the background story from reading books and stories about it, what struck me a couple twofolds was the whole Steinbrenner thing. I always knew he was from Cleveland. I never knew the story as to why he couldn't purchase the Indians. The check story is just fascinating.
Yes. Had no idea.
He stole a check, wrote it, cashed it.
Yes.
And the guy,
Vernon Stouffer.
Vernon Stouffer, who the name, when he said Stouffer, I'm like, that can't be Stouffer Foods.
Microwavable
Foods,
in
yes.
Cleveland, Ohio.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And he held that grudge for years.
And by the way, he had a right to.
No problem. But I wonder what made Steinbrenner do that.
He desperately, let me just take a step back. The credit should be given to Peter Gollenbach. Peter Gollenbach, who's in the film, wrote the book George. If you want a good winter reading, read George. The first half, it's a big book, but the first half of it is Cleveland George. So you learn what it is to be George Steinbrenner growing up as a Cleveland fan. Huge Browns fan. huge Indians fan, huge sports fan. And his whole time in his life, his big thing is, I'm going to be a famous athlete. He wasn't a famous athlete. So his big thing is, I'm going to run a famous organization. Yeah. He actually was a college football coach at Purdue and Northwestern. Like, the guy had an edge to be in sports. So he had his opportunity because of his dad's shipping company. For people who don't know, the senior Steinbrenner was a very wealthy ship magnate. Made a lot of money on ships. So he took his dad's money and bought the Pipers.
Yeah.
And then the NBA basically said, look, if you're going to play with the big boys, show your worth. Write a check and prove for how much money you had. He didn't have a nickel to his name. He and Jim Stover, which I do think there's a lot of backstory behind how that went down. I don't think there's any backstory between Vernon. Vernon did not like George. But Jim and George obviously had some sort of companionship, and he got the check, stole it, whatever, and he tried to cash it. It didn't work out, and here we are.
So the check bounced, right?
It bounced, and it got rejected, like the whole thing. Like the Stover, Jim story and George is your barroom banter. Was it stolen? Did Jim not tell his dad, Vernon? I don't know. I mean, you can figure out those details in like cocktail napkins, but in my opinion, I can see Vernon saying, what the hell happened here? And Jim saying, well, George stole the check from me, Dad, and then here we go.
You talk about real quick, I didn't know this, Ray Chapman passes away.
Yes.
And then we learn that his wife had a nervous breakdown.
In L.A.
And then her death was ruled a suicide.
Yes, it's very controversial about that too.
And then the daughter, years later,
dies,
passes away. After telling whoever her guardian was, I'm going to join my mom.
Yeah.
Was that a dream she heard?
It's some sort of like,
it's weird.
She had been really sick, and it sounds like she had like one of those like
tuberculosis.
Some one of those. I don't know what you call it, whether it's a dream or vision. Because it actually happened, so I don't know how much dream like it was.
Yeah.
No, on the other end of this, there is a sad story. Chapman was a star of Cleveland. Chapman was our Mr. Cleveland in 1919. There was a huge wedding. I know this sounds silly at the time, but the Ray Chapman and Katie Daly wedding was a huge ordeal here. In fact, you'll find, if you ever go to like newspaper archives, there were stories in this in Oklahoma, all the way throughout the country. Oh, the star player Ray Chapman, man, he's Katie Daly.
Maybe the equivalent of a Tom Brady Giselle type of thing in that era?
Yeah, because, I mean, you got to remember, too, it's about money.
Sure.
The Dalys were very wealthy. So I'm sure they had the dinero to put into public, hey, pay these writers, let's get our story told about what's going on. And again, for people, it's 100 years ago. Cleveland was a powerhouse. Cleveland was one of the top 5 cities in the country at that time. It was the Rockefeller was running this just as much as anybody. So you got to remember, putting that time period, Cleveland was a big city. It still is, but it was one of the big cities at that time. So yeah, it had a lot of angst behind it, a lot of power.
We'll have more with Andy Billman right after this.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
The R&R podcast going to be rocking and rolling with you because football season is underway. College, Ohio State, the Power Fives, the MAC, the Browns. Michael Regai, are you ready to rock and roll with some football?
Kenny, I've been ready. This is our time of year. This is what R&R is all about. We're going to be with you every week. Kenny just said it, Browns, NFL, Ohio State centric. So you got to stay with us all fall and winter long here on R&R.
That's right. The Regai and Rhoda podcast coming to you here on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe now and don't miss a show.
What's up, everyone? Chase Smith here, host of the Chase Smith Podcast, and my podcast reflects who I am. My hobbies, my interests, my passions, my curiosities, my careers, my questions, and my family. I'll spend time talking about all types of sports, movies, TV shows, trending news stories, and other cultural events, and even faith. This is who I am, and I hope I can get to know you as well. Join me on the Chase Smith Podcast, and let's have some thought-provoking conversations, only on the Press Play Podcast Network.
You're storyboarding this whole idea in your head. at the beginning, and you know you have bullet points you want to hit, and then you're putting this together, and now all these stories are coming. Was there one story that you're like, whoa, I didn't know this happened, that completely, no pun intended, came out of left field, that you had to incorporate? Or a soundbite or something?
Well, I would say, to be honest, it was reading George when I learned a lot about Steinbrenner that really got my juices flowing. I would also say, in fairness, it was audio. The Carl Mays audio was very fascinating to listen to. And then you got to put on your thinking cap to be like, okay, Carl Mays is not well liked. Carl Mays is a tough Missouri, as he would say on the audio tapes. And you got to remember, this is a guy who grew up saw a lot of death in his life, who grew up, who was really a self-taught individual kid, like, hey, go out and kill your dinner and go out and do things. Carl Mays is a Missouri guy, had a lot of angst and a lot of things. Baseball was a rough game. Was a game of Ty Cobb. Was a guy who, they had a serious rivalry. Mays protected the plate. It was not a smooth... It really changed in the Babe Ruth era. So at the end of this era, this was more of an outlaw game, where guys did get seriously hurt, where Ty Cobb did sharpen his spikes and spike people, where Carl Mays not only threatened to bean you, he beat you multiple times in a game and didn't really care. It was it was an adventurous game. So you got to remember when you listen to the Carl Mays tapes, keep that in mind. That said, it's jarring to hear a guy later in his life, that play was just as much fault as Chapman's as it is mine. It's like, are you serious? Not, I'm sorry. Right. Holy cow! I changed, very steadfast.
Now, I read somewhere later in his life, he had a little contrition to it. Is that true or no?
I think he does, but I don't think. Yes, but not to the. I'm just gonna be honest, not to the level I was thinking.
Sure.
If I had done that, I'd be like, I have never been able to sleep. I feel bad. I always put whatever I can towards the Chapman Foundation, whatever I can do. None of that. I mean, now did he ever want to kill the guy? Well, absolutely not. No. By the way, Carl Mays later on became a scout for the Indians.
Yeah.
So clearly, time heals.
Time healed. Yeah.
And that's where people do need to get off. Because I've heard people say, "Oh, well, he was a killer." It's like, I don't think that's true.
Where did you find the audio?
There was a article written in the 70s, and it kept quoting this audio. So I did tell the production team, I'm like, it's pretty clear, it's said in these articles, that Carl Mays was going to do a book, and then he died. And they keep referencing these audio tapes. Can we find the audio? They found the audio.
No kidding.
Yep.
And what year was that audio?
Oh, 60s, late 60s.
What is it, like in a library? They find
there's actually some Mays family member in San Diego who had the audio recordings, and they were very nice and kind. The Mays family has gone through. I want to do something on Mays. The Mays family has gone through a lot of grief, and they obviously defend his rightfulness, and I totally understand that. And it was very nice that they donated that film, because Mays does not come off, and I think it's fair. He's not a nice guy at times. He's very, very villainistic. I don't know how else to put it. But yeah, the audio was held by a Mays family member, and there was a lot of stories. I guess there's my answer. There's a lot of stories we could have put in the film.
Yeah.
So I guess the one is that bar thing where it happens in a poker game in some sort of train.
Oh, that was fascinating.
It just beats the crap out of Joe Woods. That was very violent.
So for anybody that doesn't know the story, basically, I know we're kind of going around it bits and pieces here. Carl Mays pitches inside, hits Chapman in the head. He collapses. They take him to the locker room. Then they take him to the hospital hours later. They do emergency surgery on his head. They remove 2-inch part of his skull. His blood pressure seemed to then improve, but then he deteriorated quickly and died, a day later?
Yeah, not even that, less than 24 hours. People have to remember, back in this time period, there were no ambulances.
Yeah.
When players got hurt, there was no medical attention in the locker room. In fact, there was a worry, but a lot of players just thought Chapman would be okay. Because that was not, that was an extreme play. Babe Ruth said it sounded like a ball went off of a metal pole. So, that is a pretty extreme play, and obviously it was for what happened. But that time period, there wasn't proper medical alerts. People didn't know how to handle it. In fact, he sat in the locker room until the game was over. That's crazy. Right. Not to get any ice treatment, not to get any kind of relief for what happened. So again, that kind of in a way, it's sad to say this, but I learned this doing sports studies. That's what kind of started changing the game. They started putting on, for people who didn't know, back in the early 1900s, 19 teens, they didn't use 50 or 60 balls. They used 10.
Yeah.
And owners would be really mad if like a home run got hit. It's like, we need that ball back.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to pay for the balls.
It was a dreary day in New York in the Polo Grounds.
Very humid.
They like to your point, they reused baseballs consistently, so they weren't white, they were brown,
Correct.
so it probably got lost
Correct.
in the daylight of the background and
Correct.
the glove and everything. And he was like a submarine pitcher, and it hit him. Did it hit him in the forehead? Probably
Temple.
the temple.
Temple, and then the whole story goes, he drops, he was bleeding from his ear, and then the scary thing is he tried to get up, he couldn't get up, and then as Chapman was being helped off the field by his teammates, Chapman collapsed. The Polo Grounds was a long locker room.
Yeah, the locker rooms at the Polo Grounds, for people that don't know, was beyond center
Correct.
field. Mm-hmm.
Correct. So it's it's got to be probably a 400 or 500 walk. He collapses right before he gets in there. Collapses in center field. So it was a very dramatic thing. We're not trying to Hollywood it. It was a terrible day.
Yeah.
Very sad to be a wife to get a telegram in 1920 to say, hey, you need to come to the Polo Grounds. But she didn't know what happened. She goes, something's happened to your husband. She goes overnight into New York, arrives early morning, and entrusts speaker, the guy who's the star of your team and manager, who was the one who convinced Chapman to play in 1920s, he was going to retire, then has to tell Katie Daly that your husband just passed away.
I know.
Mm-hmm.
That's an impossible spot.
Yeah.
Impossible. And it's remarkable the Indians won after that. It
Yeah.
really is. They had a very bad losing streak, which is understandable after the whole thing happened.
When you're doing this and you have ideas of what audio you want to get, was there any clips, audio, interviews of people that you wanted to interview that didn't want to, maybe you can't name names.
Sure.
Or were there elements that you wanted to get into this that you couldn't get?
The elements were there, so that we were lucky there. There's always a few names in there that we try to get. There was one or two players who played on both teams who I really wanted to do it, and they just didn't want to do it. And that happens. That honestly is not unusual. I did want one or two former Yankees staff members, but they were very uncomfortable about George.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes, George, look, let's go on that subject for a second. George is very powerful. George did a lot of things. There's a lot of things he did bad. There's a lot of things he did good. And there's a lot of even power here in the city. If you talk to some of the higher-ups, there are still some people, not as many anymore, but you'll still have some people who own Guardians and Yankee season tickets, and if you ask them, it's because of Steinbrenner. So there's a lot of ties still to those kind of things. There used to be a lot more. They've dwindled in years, but I know one or two in my head. I know it's like, yeah, he's definitely got both.
Wow.
And it's because of Steinbrenner.
When you went through this process, and I'm just curious because in the reporter side of me, when I do a story, whether it's like a really in-depth story, you like Scott says, you storyboard things, and you storyboard things way more than I do because you're more advanced in that side of things. But I noticed you shot some shots at Doubleday Field in Cooperstown.
Yes.
Where did you get your train pictures and your shots in the train?
Okay, actually, it's here in Cleveland. There is a famous train depot right here in town. And to tell you how famous it is, for people who have seen the film, now the title escapes me, Robert Redford. He's a famous hitter.
The Natural.
Natural,
not Field of Dreams.
Natural, but same idea. The Natural train car shots were actually shot here in Cleveland.
Huh.
So that's how we figured out. I go, geez, these are beautiful. They go, it's actually in Cleveland, Ohio. So there's a famous train depot. It's in a little sketcy area in town. But if you go past there are trains from the 40s, the 30s, and the 20s. They're still kept around, and that's where we shot everything.
Wow. You just get permission, they tell you go in?
They did. They were very kind. We took, obviously, a full day. Not a full day. Well, 4-hour day, 5-hour day. It's a long day.
One question that I thought watching it, was there something about this story that surprised you that you didn't know about prior to actually conducting the interviews and then putting together the entire documentary?
I would say the audio sound of Maze was a big one. I'd also say how close, like I was kind of referencing before, and I keep hitting the same storyline. There's two of them. Chapman and how much he meant to the city. Chapman was not a small figure. There's a lot of people who debate he should be in the Hall of Fame. There's a lot of people who debate whether Carl Mays should be in the Hall of Fame. So these are not just two random players who happen to be good one year. They had very good long careers. So I think the thing that people need to realize is these two players were very, very strong at what they do. And I'll add another layer. The Red Sox did a lot for both these teams. Joe Woods and Speaker traded to the Indians. Babe Ruth and Carl Mays traded from the Red Sox.
Yeah.
So the Red Sox had a lot of help into what happened in these teams. And then I think the other thing that I kind of learned, the Steinbrenner thing I can go on and on.
Sure.
But I'll give one more, is how the era of baseball changed. 20 was the end of the dead ball era. So the Indians winning was the end of bunting and slapping and running around, and the birth of the long ball, Babe Ruth, was starting really in 21. So 1920 was really the last season of rough, tumble baseball, you know, Ty Cobb type stuff, running around bases, all that kind of transitioned into the long ball Yankees era. So it was kind of the big championship, but also the end of an era.
Also, in the point of the dead ball era, and Scott knows way more about it than I do in terms of the history, is that they changed the baseball regulation where the balls needed to be more white. They you know,
and the spitball too.
And the spitball, and then ballparks got a little smaller too.
Everything changed, and so let's put in today's perspective. So I went down to Game 2 for Yankees Guardians this year, and I obviously took in a wonderful game. Right team won. To win in New York is fun. So riding on the train right back, you know, I was sitting next to some young, energetic Yankee fans. And I was overhearing them saying, "Of course, that was such a Cleveland win. They would bunt to start the game." I said, "What do you mean?" I go, "Aaron Judge, he hits home runs." I go, "Oh, so bunting's not cool?" But my point is, it's ironic. 100 years later, we were with a Chapman, Speaker, bunting and slap hitting team, and the Yankees were Babe Ruth. And here we are 100 years later, the Guardians with Quan and Rosario, all those guys. Even Oscar Gonzalez had that blue hit and that big
contact hits.
Yes. So it's amazing how 100 years later, it's gone back to what we were.
It's still the same, yeah.
How long did this documentary take you from when you conceptualized it to when it was done and you were done?
Okay, so when people hear this, I have a side note. Under a year. It took 10 months. Wow. Well, here's why. We had COVID. So all we did was plan. As I tell people, it's like, you had nothing else to do. So we'd have meetings and meetings and meetings. So once the ban started getting lifted in April of 2021, we were ready. It's like we could just fire off things that we had rehearsed in our brain so much. So a normal film takes a year and a half. This one was like 9 months. But the reason being is because we had planned and well thought out so much. We really started in December, and we were done by end of September.
I love how you told the story with the cameras. Like, for instance, there was a pan that you would do, and you can't do it by hand, but it's when you kind of walk down the bleachers. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. It really, I mean, it by itself, it doesn't look important, but it adds this mystique.
I'm a big believer, and I learned this from Fritz Mitchell, so I want to give the credit to the director I learned from. It's good to be able to touch something, right? So in that field, I know you brought up Cooperstown. There's some shots we did at Muzzy Field. Muzzy Field's in Bristol, Connecticut. It's actually one of the oldest ballparks around, and actually, happenstance, Babe Ruth played several games in Muzzy Field. So that's why we chose that field.
Sure.
Because it's actually a ballpark that still has a lot of nostalgia and still has things that are built in the early 1900s. So when you shoot those things and you can see there's locker room shots we did. They had not really restored it. They were still tiny wood boxes and wood benches, and it makes you really think like, geez, like this was the time period. And I think it helps you bring back to see that kind of stuff, at least in my opinion.
I think a big question I have for you, Andy, watching your film, which I absolutely love, by the way, how and where did you find Ray Chapman's sister, and what is the story behind that? Where did it take place? When did it take place?
I'm ready. So there was a television camera crew who were going to do a documentary on Chapman back in the 90s, and it failed. It just ended up not making it. As a documentarian, that's usually the norm. It's usually very, very hard to get something going like this because it does take money and it takes time. So they ended up not doing it. So Danielle Abrico, I believe it was Danielle, she was the one who actually found the crew who had several interviews, and one of them was Chapman's sister. Wow. And that really brought the story to life.
I think if you don't have that interview, like, it doesn't hit as well because she's giving you background information of her brother, the personality, and what he was like in the field.
You just contact them, and you don't know if they're going to say yes or no.
And I mean, look, you learn over time. And by the way, we licensed it. We paid them money because I mean they did their work. It wasn't like we did it for free. But like, you just hope people like that keep stuff around because it will always be used. It goes back to the Mays family. They kept that audio. I don't know why, but they kept those reels.
Wow.
And because they kept those reels, you get to hear Carl Mays.
So when was that interview with Ray Chapman's sister? Do you have a date?
1990s. It was in the 1990s. I know that. Like, it was like, as you can tell by the framing, like, I'd say early 90s.
Okay. It looked older than that to me.
No, it was definitely 90s. They had beta tape. It was like
Okay.
good old beta. It was not 1 inch yet. Or it's not like 3/4. God, people don't know. Those are TV terms. But it was not 3/4 tape. It was definitely on beta. But no, they shot her like at some hotel room, and she was really old. I mean, she had to be in like her 90s.
Yeah.
But she had her fastball. We'll use a baseball term.
Yeah.
And she was able to tell really, really good stories. And she was really emotional in the interview.
So we'll wrap this up here, John. And Andy, what's your next project? What do you got
Well,
going
I
on?
have several projects going on. I'm actually working on a project for ESPN that has yet to be announced, so I can't announce it here today. But I'm producing it. Not directing it, producing. I do a lot of producing too for people. I'm working on a Mafia project right now on Henry Hill. On his last time, I'm co-directing with another female director in LA.
Nice.
She got the last ever interview with Henry before he passed away. So we're repiecing his life. I'm also in the midst of pitching several other films that I'm in the midst of doing. Like one's a murder story in Boston. There's a couple more sports ones I'm doing. There's a famous baseball player named Dick Allen who came up through the 70s, and we're doing a story on him and what his impactful season was in '72 with the White Sox, and how that really changed the city. There's a great book called Hot Dog, Chili Dogs, and Dick Allen. And Dick Allen, to a lot of people don't know, Dick saved the White Sox. The White Sox were going under similar transformations the Indians were. They were terrible. There's sad stats with the White Sox in the early 70s. They were, like some games, 4,000 fans. How's that possible in Chicago? But anyways, my point being is Dick Allen, 72, saved them. And there's a lot of people who I interviewed who said, if Dick Allen does not have an MVP season 72, we're done. There's no fannies in the seats and we're out of here. So we're helping to retell that story about the importance of Dick Allen. He was a character. He wasn't just a White Sox. Played for the Phillies, played for the Dodgers, played for the Cardinals. Was a really character of the game. For people to go, how much of a character? Power hitter. Yeah. There's a great cover in SI. And this is, obviously we've gone away from these times, but it is a great cover where he's juggling baseballs and smoking cigarettes in the dugout. It's a famous SI cover.
I think I've seen that photo.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's got a red, which the White Sox went through some weird transformations. Yeah. It's in a red White Sox helmet at that time, and he's juggling baseballs, smoking cigarettes.
Where do fans go to watch this documentary, War on the Diamond?
Apple, Amazon. You're like, I need TV. Get it. Video on demand. You can go to DirecTV, AT&T. Any big cable provider will have it on video on demand. You can get it on there. Most people today use Amazon, Apple TV. But any of those platforms, and hey, if you need stocking stuffers, War on the Diamond DVDs coming out in Christmas time, stock your stuffings or Hanukkah gifts, no worries. We're on the Diamond. We're here to solve your problems. It's a famous, we're candlestick people. What was that famous? Bull Durham. Yeah. So we're your candlestick people. We're going to give you good wedding gifts. Yeah. So anyways, all those other platforms. And you can always go for more information on waronthediamond.com. I also have my own Instagram page called Official Cleveland Sports. You can see me on there being silly after games and also talking about War on the Diamond.
Andy, this has been a pleasure. I've been trying to get a hold of you for a year, and you first brought this out talking with Danielle, and it didn't work out. And then when you guys are coming back with this release, I'm like, I got to revisit this. And I reached out to Sean, and it all worked out, man. This is it worked out better because we got to do it here in the Baseball Heritage Museum at League Park here on Cleveland's east side.
Well, let's ask. We'll do a quick roundtable. Will the Guardians win the World Series in the next 3 years? I say actually yes. I do. I think they are going to win.
Wow. You're putting me on the spot here.
They need another bat, and if they get another bat,
3 years.
Whether it's internally or through free agency, I think they have a very good chance. But they need that next bat.
They do.
I'll say this: there's a lot of young guys in the organizations in minor leagues right now that will be called up this year.
That's my point.
And next year that are going to be studs in theory. You never know with prospects, hit or miss.
Of course.
They could be a missing link in addition to a veteran bat that Scott is alluding to. It wouldn't surprise me.
I just think this is the first time where it's like, this is overloaded.
Yeah.
Like, you can see the ooze pouring out of the Guardians right now. I just think it's too much talent.
And you know what? And the one thing that we don't know what's going to happen is they're banning the shift. And if that continues, that will change. Maybe it won't go back to where it was because nothing ever reverts back to where it was before the shift became what it is. because I'm sure some other incarnation will happen.
Oh, of course.
But that, I think, will change.
And that, okay, to your point, that's where winning 4 Gold Gloves probably should have won 5.
Right.
Will really stand out. If you have leaky defense and no shift, you watch.
That banning of the shift is going to help Jose Ramirez, by the way.
Jose Ramirez. Yeah. How about, by the way, to a guy who's not here anymore, Franmil Reyes. There are guys who are going to start getting hits who could not get hits for a long time. And also, too, to be fair, the Josh Donaldsons of the world, too, who couldn't hit into shifts for a long time. So, no, it's going to I just real quickly, as a side topic, I'm glad for the game of baseball. I've talked to a lot of people in the game. I worked with a lot of people in the game. Sports change for good reasons. 3-point shots, clock shots, football rules changes. Baseball's always been the slowest sport to change things. These clock rules, these things, it's going to drive you crazy. It's going to be good for the game. It really, really is going to bring a good tempo.
Well, my take on the shift was always, well, you're a Major League Baseball player. Learn not to hit into the shift. However, I've come around on it because pitching has gotten so much better that you're hurting the sport with the shift, and there's only so much you can do as a hitter. You got to do something, and banning it is better for the game.
It's analytics driven. A lot of these teams are home runs, doubles, and strikeouts.
And I will admit, I'm an analytics guy from the standpoint that I like numbers and I know why they're doing what they're doing. But things can always go too far.
Correct.
And they will have to make adjustments like they've made in the last 6, 7, 8 years with strikeouts being higher and a whole litany of other things. But it'll be interesting to see, you ban the shift, but how are teams going to still, quote unquote, shift in a different way?
Well, that's my point.
I mean? Right.
You're going to see plays like Jimenez diving for balls now. You're going to see a lot of exciting baseball. By the way, you're going to sadly see some balls that Bieber usually not getting a shift. They're going to go in the infield now for base hits. It's all over the place, but it's going to make for a more exciting game.
And I think we're all in agreement here that the Guardians are built really well.
Oh, my gosh.
And then your prediction of a World Series, I hope, comes true. Wouldn't shock me. I hope it happens. But you know what? The good thing is we're going to have some really exciting, entertaining games coming up in the next couple of years.
Yes, and I'm getting a scooter for Christmas, yes.
You're getting a scooter, yes. And when it happens, Andy, all 3 of us will be in the parade hoisting Tito up on that scooter.
Oh, yeah, I'll be in a scooter.
Andy, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, go check out War on the Diamond on all those platforms that Andy discussed. And a big shout out to Ricardo Rodriguez here at the Baseball Heritage Museum, opening up the shop on a day that it's closed to come on his personal time to let us do that. We thank him tremendously. And this has been a phenomenal conversation. Scott and I could talk with you for hours about your documentary and baseball.
I get the feeling I'll be back.
Probably.
You're coming back, yeah.
All the best to your family.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
John, what was so cool about doing this is that we got to do it in League Park, interview Andy, and he had so many interesting stories about. I love the fact of piecing together these documentaries and finding out how he pieces them together. So I like digging into the weeds, but also the stories too, especially the Carl Mays audio. You know, the fact that he was able to get that audio, which I think made that documentary what it was.
I agree. And I think what we basically told him, you probably couldn't do that piece without that audio. Correct. Or you could do it, it wouldn't probably hit as well as it did, especially with Ray Chapman's sister. I didn't even know that even existed, let alone the Carl Mays audio. But it was really cool to talk about that history of that unfortunate story in a building that has so much history that's well over 100 years old on Cleveland's east side.
Right. One of the most underrated rivalries in sports here in the United States, definitely.
Yeah, and it gets lost, I think, in a lot of other rivalries. Right. And since they don't play consistently enough, they probably, may not be known outside of the Cleveland area. New York probably doesn't look at Cleveland as a big rival, but there is definitely history there, and I'm glad to see that Andy tying that together with, like we said, that unfortunate baseball tragedy in its history as well.
All right, no question. Well, you can download all of our podcasts right here on the Press Play Podcast Network. You can follow me on Twitter, Scott Sable, Fox8, and on Instagram, Scott Sable, PICS.
You can follow me at John_Sable. Follow the pod at Sable Brothers. If you haven't already, listen and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening, everyone.